In my career, I've had the unique opportunity of working in the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s in New York, working at Microsoft in the 2000s when it was at the peak of its dominance, and then going to Silicon Valley and starting my own startup and raising millions of dollars from venture capitalists in Sand Hill Road. And for the last several years, I've been a venture capitalist investing in companies. And in some of those cases, I've had these companies move from places like Arizona and Toronto to New York. And in some cases, we asked our companies to stay where they were, such as Montreal and Utah. And the question I've always asked myself is, why do some companies thrive in certain geographies versus others? And why do certain geographies do really well in terms of tech innovation versus others? And to answer this question, you have to go way back to the beginning of why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. And the answer is because of New Jersey. That gentleman right there is a guy named William Shockley at Bell Labs who invented the transistor. He made a world-changing invention that he later won the Nobel Peace Prize for, but he didn't feel like he got the financial rewards of that invention from Bell Labs, and in anger he quit and was convinced by this guy, Professor Thurman at Stanford University, to move all the way to the West Coast. The reason he moved to the West Coast is because Stanford created something called the Stanford Industrial Park. The reason they created this is because they were angry that all their graduates were leaving Stanford University and going to East Coast. And they created a place where these graduates could now stay in the West Coast and freely think of new ideas about creating technologies that have a non-polluting effect on the environment. Shockley stayed at Stanford and eventually created what was really the first startup in Silicon Valley, called Shockley Semiconductor. Big things have small beginnings, and one of the most interesting things is that Shockley created this and had no engineers in that state because all the engineers were here in New Jersey. But he was such a famous scientist at the time, he put an ad out in the New York Times, and within a couple of weeks he had several hundred applications from all across the country from the top engineers wanting to work for him. It'd be the equivalent of today if Steve Jobs was still alive, that he wanted to do a startup in Alaska, he'd probably easily hire 1,000 engineers in a minute if he had a want ad out in the papers. However, as brilliant a scientist as Shockley was, he was a very difficult person to deal with. Historians have noted that he had bouts of paranoia, he had anger management issues, and he had a lot of controversial beliefs that made his employees very uncomfortable, such as the belief that people below a certain IQ should be sterilized, and that the future of humanity depended on the smartest people being able to advance their gene pool, so therefore he openly and freely talked about donating to sperm banks. And this made a lot of his employees very uncomfortable. 8 of these employees, who later became known as the Treason State by Shockley, were from the East Coast, and these guys decided they couldn't work for him anymore, but they didn't want to move back to the East Coast because their families were settled into California. They decided to form a collective and went out and tried to raise money to build their own company. It was an unheard of idea at that time. And what these guys ended up eventually doing is getting money from another inventor named Sherman Fairchild, who said, hey, these guys were hired by a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, so they got to be able to do something. So all of a sudden, these guys created a startup called Fairchild Semiconductor, in which they each owned about 7% of the business. And they worked there for several years, and they made some great inventions. However, Sherman Fairchild messed this entire thing up by eventually executing a clause in their contract where he was able to buy all their shares at a set price. So these guys went from being owners in a business to being employees. And eventually these guys left, but 2 of these guys started Intel Capital. And two other of these guys started Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Bayer, which is a big venture capital firm, and another employee of Fairchild started Sequoia Capital. So all of a sudden in Silicon Valley, you had all these employees that were, have venture capital dollars and, Silicon technology experience building these companies. And because of what Fairchild did, you can trace a genealogy of all those 2,000 startups to Fairchild Semiconductor. Such companies like Apple, Cisco, Facebook, Google, all these companies have roots way back to Fairchild Semiconductor. And so if you think about it, one small move by a mad scientist in New Jersey resulted in Silicon Valley becoming what it was today. And now the answer is, what is the answer for tech innovation? And the answer is very simple. It's about the founders, the makers, and the creators. If you attract them, everything else falls into place. But what are the ingredients that allow you to attract the right founders to your geography? And when I did my research, it came down to 5 core principles. One is a home field advantage. What does your geography offer that no other place offers? In Silicon Valley, it was the fact that it was free thinking, that people could go there and have crazy ideas and do that. When I was trying to do my startup in Seattle, I couldn't convince the venture capitalists to give me money. I had to move down to the Bay Area because the VC says, oh, that idea is crazy enough, we like it, we'll give you a couple $1 million. Infrastructure was also important as well. The Stanford Industrial Park had a huge impact on Silicon Valley by creating a place where people can actually go, meet with other people, collaborate, and think up of ideas. It was like the first co-working space in the world in the 1950s. Founder-friendly regulations was really important. In California, non-competes were non-enforceable, which is why the Treason State, when they left Shockley Semiconductor, were able to do so freely without him holding to any contracts, because California is a very worker-friendly state. And eventually, when they got tired of being a Fairchild and wanted to leave and do their own things and create other semiconductor companies, they were able to do so because California believed that workers should have the right to freely go out and do anything they want without being bound to their previous employer. Capital access became very prevalent in Silicon Valley because some of these guys who left Fairchild became venture capitalists and seeded other semiconductor companies. And so was talent access, because Shockley did an incredibly good job of getting so much talent in the semiconductor industry to move from the East Coast to the West Coast that talent was in abundance in Silicon Valley. And that's why Silicon Valley did what it did. Now, when the tech bubble hit in the late 1990s, a place called New York City really wanted to become the next Silicon Valley. So much so that they called themselves Silicon Alley. Now, there was no Silicon in New York City except if you went to the offices of a plastic surgeon. And what happened, and what I noticed happening back then, is that I came up with a term called the cargo cult startups. And cargo cult, if you're not familiar with it, is when World War II, when the military was going to remote Pacific Island bases and setting up bases with airplanes and tanks and artillery, the natives looked at this and said, oh, we want that technology too. So the natives would make airplanes out of bamboo sticks or walkie-talkies out of coconuts and think that they should work the same way. That's what I noticed happening in New York City is people sitting with laptops on couches with lattes thinking that, hey, we'll just copy what Silicon Valley does and we'll become Silicon Valley. Or throwing big tech events and blowing $1 million on a launch party. And it was a disaster for New York because the dot-com bubble burst and New York had a very big downturn in the tech economy. However, a unique thing happened a couple of years later is that New York realized, why are we trying to be like Silicon Valley? We shouldn't be. We should be like New York. And New York did really well in media, so a lot of media companies like Gawker and Engadget started coming up. New York understood e-commerce really well, so a lot of companies like Warby Parker and Birchbox and Casper started. Companies that would have never started on the West Coast, because the West Coast really likes things that are all in the digital world. But New York started doing really well in these e-commerce companies and these media companies. So much so that New York said, we don't want to be called Silicon Alley. No one talks about New York as Silicon Alley anymore, they just call it New York. So what's happened here is that the founders realized that there's a certain type of ecosystem that's created, a home field advantage in New York that's good for a certain type of startup. And the founders that realized that their startup didn't do well in New York moved to the West Coast. Now, there's one founder in particular who realized very early on that the ingredients that he needed for his company's success was not in Silicon Valley or New York, but it was in Seattle. Now, the reason Bill Gates looks so relaxed and dreamy in this picture is because he decided to move to Seattle as opposed to Silicon Valley when he moved his company from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And when I was an intern at Microsoft, you had the unique opportunity of going to Bill Gates' house and having dinner at his house. And one of the interns asked, why did you move to Seattle? And he's talked about this many times. And it really is that for him, Seattle offered a home field advantage in that it was a distraction-free environment. Because in Silicon Valley, even in the 70s, there were a lot of people jumping from startup to startup because that's what you did in Silicon Valley. And Bill Gates was very worried about the fact that he would have a very high cost of employee retention in Silicon Valley. And he said, you know what, Seattle, if people come there, if I can convince people to come here, they'll stay here for a long time. The other thing was infrastructure. Bill Gates didn't like the cubicle environments of Silicon Valley and said, I wanted to have my own environment, my own place where every engineer could have their own private office. And he knew that he could buy land for cheap in Bellevue, Washington, and Redmond, Washington, and build a massive campus. Regulations were also very important to him because there was no state income tax in Washington, so he was able to pay people less money. Also, non-competes were enforceable in Washington, so he was actually able to keep people more tightly wound to Microsoft versus any other company. He also didn't need venture capital, so he said, hey, he was making so much money from his deal with IBM for providing him with the operating system that he says, I don't need to go to Silicon Valley and convince these guys to give me a lot of money. And also people. When Bill Gates bought people to Microsoft, he, just like William Shockley was able to bring people to Silicon Valley with his reputation, by the time that Bill Gates moved to Seattle, his reputation was cemented as a tech innovator, where so much so that a lot of people were willing to move to Seattle and work for Microsoft and be part of that commitment. Now, with that, if you look at Seattle over here and the big blob over here on the upper left side over here, Seattle, that blob right there shows the number of billionaires created in certain geographies, and Seattle's is very fat. It's because Seattle has a reputation of not producing a lot of companies, a lot of startups, but the ones they do produce become really big and really have a global impact, such as companies like Starbucks, McCraw, which is the first cell phone company, Microsoft, Amazon, Costco. So, Seattle's become known as a place where companies have the freedom to build, grow slowly, quietly, without distraction, and become big. And Seattle likes that, and that's how Seattle wants to stay. Now, let's talk about New Jersey for a second. What is New Jersey's home field advantage? Besides our taxes, our tolls on the turnpike, and our traffic, what do we have to offer in the technology community that could be interesting? And when I looked at New Jersey, I first started doing my research, I looked at football, for example. I'm a big football fan. And when you look at that really strong red dot over there in New Jersey produces an incredible amount of talent in the football arena. And that's because just New Jersey is a football state. But all that talent leaves, and a lot of people said if Rutgers was able to keep that talent, they'd have a championship program every year. When I look at the engineering talent that comes out of New Jersey, it's the same thing. We have a lot of engineering talent that comes out of New Jersey, but it also leaves, go to the West Coast and other places because they don't feel like tech is interesting in New Jersey. We also have a great history of inventors in New Jersey. And New Jersey is actually sixth in venture capital raising across the country, but it's in different industries. So we have all these great things about New Jersey, but why does it feel like New Jersey is a hippo on a treadmill looking at a unicorn? And the reason is, when I go back to what are the 5 ingredients, we're missing 3 of them. One is, what's our home field advantage? We always try to compete with New York and try to be like New York. What's our infrastructure? We never had a really good playground where entrepreneurs could go and play. And we've never had really good regulations. And when I look at the home field advantage, I say New Jersey needs to be more like New York, where we become a distraction-free place to create big, serious companies. 6,000 engineers used to work at Bell Labs. Why can't 6,000 engineers work there again, where we have 100 engineers working at 60 different startups in Bell Labs? And I think we should not focus on media and companies that New York does well in. We should focus on the hard stuff like supply chain technology, SaaS, Internet of Things. These are things that New Jersey has a core competency in that they could do really well in. Infrastructure is also very important. We haven't had a playground in quite a long time that we could really call a great place for entrepreneurs to be. But that's changing with places like Bell Works, Fort Monmouth, Asbury Park, New York Venture Partners. And at the same thing, we need to push our university to create more innovation zones, such as what Tiger Labs is doing in Princeton. And there's 25% of real estate in New Jersey that's owned by the state goes unused. Those could become great innovation hubs. Regulations is also very tough in New Jersey because our taxes are so high. And what I propose here is that let's reward the victory. Let's say if you move to New Jersey, or if you start an innovative company in New Jersey, you don't have to pay capital gains tax when you have an exit event. This will result in more companies coming to New Jersey, hiring more employees. It will actually increase the tax base for New Jersey. And if you like this idea, go to connectedjersey.com and support that petition. New Jersey is a great hub for invention, and I think since the 1950s we've lost that tech innovation, and I want to hopefully get it back because I don't want to have to move back to the West Coast because the West Coast just doesn't have those Jersey diners. So if you want to continue, this conversation, please feel free to email me, visit me at Bellworks, or call me over here. Thank you very much.